All set.
Okay, let's try that again. Convene the meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission with the City Council Ordinance Committee. Welcome to everybody who is here. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Are there any changes? Okay, seeing none, then we will stick with the agenda that we have. Next item is public forum. This is an opportunity for any member of the public who'd like to speak to us on pretty much any item you'd like to. We are having a public hearing on the short-term rentals coming up right after this. So if you want to speak to that and want to wait for the public hearing, that would be a better place to speak. And when we get into that, may get a little introduction, but then go right into the public hearing. So is there, Megan, do you know of anyone who wants to speak during public forum?
Yes, Benjamin Reddick. I'm going to enable Erica Reddick's microphone. I think that's where we'll find him. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Benjamin Reddick. I mean, obviously, I'm the husband of Erica Reddick, who I'm sure you've heard from a couple of times. I just want to say I'm really disappointed by how much effort and work we're having to go through in order to make this purchase on a home that has had 3 units in it since the beginning of time, to be honest with you. And because there's an issue with some paperwork in the city where they can't make a determination, it's really weird to me how the determination that they're trying to make and what's being done is the one that forces us to pay the most amount of money to do something that is not in alignment with how the structure has been utilized for what, 60 years?
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I don't
Sure.
want to cut you off, but could you just give a little bit more of an introduction to what the issue is that you're talking about? I'm not really clear, and I'm not sure if other people know as well. Sorry about that.
No problem. We have a home, 251 Standiford Road. It's been in our family for 60 some odd years. Since it was built, it was a triplex. Because of some rule that is in place now that I believe is intended to stop builders from coming in and doing certain things in the region. We're being forced, trying to buy the home from one of our in-laws, we're being forced to convert a triplex into a duplex, which lowers the value of the home for one. And in addition to that, costs tens of thousands of dollars. That's the issue we're going to. And fighting with the city, when we clear one issue and one reason that they give us for why there's a problem with our attorney and the thousands of dollars we're spending there, they come up with another one because the city can just infinitely come up with as many barriers as possible if they don't want you to do something. And I have a major problem with that. And it doesn't seem like anybody else seems to have a major problem with that. And we have tenants. So we actually provide reasonably priced housing in an area where people say they have an issue with housing. We're offering it and we're being penalized for it because they don't really want it. In addition to that, we talk about wanting to facilitate minority ownership of things and whatnot. I'm a minority. I don't know if you can tell, I'm Black. So we're trying to change some things here and make some positive moves for our family. And I seem to be hindered. So it's just a lot of the rhetoric I'm hearing doesn't seem to be matching a lot of the actions being taken by the city. And I would just love for someone to consider doing something to assist us with this issue. That's where I am right now. Just a ton of frustration, not directly at any of you in particular, but yeah, not hearing a lot of positive things from the court system or from anywhere in any of these forums that we've been a part of. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, if anybody else is interested in speaking during the open forum, please either raise your hand or leave a quick note in the chat. I see Erica's hand is up again. Did you want to speak on short-term rentals or did you want to speak now?
I would like to speak on short-term rentals, but I would just like to make a follow-up for what Benjamin just shared.
Okay.
So the main issue that we're facing now, what he said was the city has kept us in court for 2.5 years. So every time we've overcome one of their objections to keeping the 3 units, which again, it's the city assessor, the new assessment even says that it's a triplex. It's been a triplex. Every other city department calls it a triplex and has since 1963 when it was built. And yet the city has had us in court for 2.5 years. And every time we overcome an objection or a reason why they're trying to force us to remove one of the units, they come up with a new one. And the most recent one is this idea that if the unit was empty for more than 60 days, you lose the right to use the special treatment that you've received. So in a low density residential unit, you're not allowed to have more than a duplex unless you have permission from the city. But in the 1960s, the city didn't keep good records. So it also does not have our original building permit. So because of that, the city attorney continues to look for reasons to penalize us. So according to them, one of the units was unoccupied for more than 60 days while it was being renovated. That happens to be an illegal ordinance by the city of Burlington. It has never been approved by the state, and yet the city attorney, we should have had a summary judgment last year, and now over a year later, we're still waiting for the court. There was supposed to be a conference call yesterday. The city attorney didn't have their documents together. So it's fight after fight after fight. And this is really shameful. And in case anyone on this committee or these committees is wondering why things are so expensive in Burlington, it's because of this nonsense. So I just wanted to follow up on that. I see the city attorney has come on. She's listening. So if anyone wants to speak to that, we'd be happy to hear why the city continues to pursue illegal ordinances to punish landlords like Benjamin and I, a woman and a Black person trying to save our home so we can take care of our mother. So I would just like to offer that, and I will have comments during short-term rental as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan, is there anyone else?
I don't see anyone else. Could you hear me, Andy?
I just heard, no. I only
Sorry,
heard you.
I don't see anyone else.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for those comments, by the way. We're not really in a position here, unless there's somebody who wants to chime in, to really do a back and forth on public comments like that, but we do appreciate your bringing them to us. So with that, we're going to close the public forum and move on to item 3, which is the public hearing for proposed ZA 20-05 for short-term rentals. And we do have the public hearing scheduled for tonight, but Megan or Scott, would you like to introduce this for the public hearing? I don't think you have any updates for us on this, but if you would like to introduce it for the public hearing.
No, so Scott and I were talking earlier, and we're going to give maybe a little bit more detailed overview to what the ordinance is than we normally would for a public hearing, just because this has been changing a lot, and we want to make sure that everybody on the committee and everyone who's listening is all on the same page about the current status of what's in the proposal. So Scott, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So nothing is different from the last time we've seen this. So I'll limit my comments mostly to a recap. So there's 3 main components to this. There's a pretty limited role for zoning at this point. We simply identify that short-term rentals are allowable where residences are. Most of this package resides in Chapter 18, minimum housing and rental registration. And it's being set up as an annual rental registration program, really. And that enables a lot greater flexibility going forward to make adjustments that might be needed depending on outcomes, as opposed to having this housed in zoning. The third component is this nightly fee or tax that we've talked about. That's something separate to be dealt with by the city council. But those are the 3 main pieces: zoning, Chapter 18, and this nightly fee. We've put together a table in chapter 18 that summarizes the various scenarios dealing with owner occupancy versus not. Just to quickly summarize that, on-site primary residency is required for single family and duplexes. Off-site hosting is only allowed for 3 and 4 unit multifamily buildings. And the latest draft has 5 or more unit buildings not allowing short-term rentals at all, with the exception there being, or I shouldn't even say it's an exception. The committee had decided a couple of months ago for a carve out that regardless of the building configuration, if it's your unit, your primary residence, you can do an STR. And the last piece of all of this is that we're mirroring the state's minimum threshold of 14 days. So if you're short-term renting, really in any scenario for 14 days or less within a year, you fly on the radar entirely. Above that, you'll need to deal with the short-term rental. And that's the brief recap. Megan, are there additional details you want to jump into?
We haven't spent a lot of time talking about it, but one other way that you can short-term rent that's allowed in this is to just rent bedrooms within your home. So there are standards in here that allow up to 5 bedrooms within a residence to be rented as a short-term rental. That does require that the unit where those bedrooms are being rented out of is the host primary residence. And then the other thing that I'll just mention is that a lot of the document that's in your packet, we haven't spent a ton of time talking about it as a committee, but there are standards included since this lives in the minimum housing code. There are standards included for the type of information that's required to be submitted as part of that rental registration form, as well as the minimum life safety standards that a short-term rental has to meet. So that's what makes up the rest of the amendments to Chapter 18. But otherwise, I think that summarizes where we are right now.
Good, thank you. Are there any questions on the commission or council, just on the status of things? Now, I don't want to get into discussion about it, but just status of things, and then we'll go to public forum, our public hearing. Emily?
I think this is in reference to the status of this. My recollection is that we were not in support of allowing 3 and 4 units to be owner occupied. So I'm surprised to hear that now. That's not my recollection of how things move forward. And then the 4 or more units, I thought we were still sort of talking around about that. So I'm not remembering that we are landing at the place that we are.
So the committee has the option tonight to make any additional changes to what's outlined here. I think at our last meeting, we did walk through the chart in terms of where primary residence is required in those different circumstances. And the chart that's in here has remained unchanged from the version that you all looked at and approved for the public hearing at your last meeting.
So as Megan said, if people want, after we go to public hearing, if people want to make changes or offer amendments or anything like that, there'll certainly be an opportunity to do that. But it sounds like what we have in our packet is what was warned for public hearing. Soraya?
Yeah, and then just a question, and I'm sorry, I think we may have talked about this last time, but on the Article 13, like line 23, 24, I guess just make it like, because we are using the language of building, I guess I want to make sure that for multi-unit buildings, we're not limiting it to 5 bedrooms, or if we are doing that and just making sure we're doing that on purpose.
What page are you on?
I am on page, and I assume it's also later on in section 18, but I'm on page 9.
So I see what you're asking. Yeah, we can we can look at that language and clarify how that relates to the partial unit short-term rentals in terms of the per building limits. The intention was not to apply the per building limits to the just bedrooms within a unit. But while we're taking public comments, Scott, maybe if you could just double check that definition and how it relates to the table for partial units and make sure that that is true.
The table as it's written makes the distinction between whole and partial. And so there is no limit on the partial units, except that it's limited to 5 bedrooms within any particular unit. So at risk of being presumptuous, I don't think there's a problem there because they are split out clearly in the table.
Great, thanks, Scott.
Any other questions before we go to public hearing? Okay, so let open up our public hearing. And this is the public hearing on the proposed ZA 20-05 short-term rentals. Megan and Scott just reviewed what is in the packet that was approved at least for public hearing by this group. And we welcome now public comments on it through this public hearing process. And I'm going to turn this over to Megan because you're the one who could tell who's asking to speak.
Okay, we'll start with the list of people who contacted me before the meeting. And if anyone else that's on wants to speak, you can use the raise hand feature or leave a note in the chat. So we'll start with Erica Reddick, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Megan, for taking care of all this and making sure everyone has the opportunity to share. I just want to say once again how disappointed I am with people who have been appointed to these committees who don't really seem to take a sincere look at who they're affecting and all of the ways that this is actually going to harm the community. So you say things like you want it to be less expensive to live in Burlington. You say you want affordable housing. You say you want people to have safe places to live. And yet you continue to behave in such a way that will ensure things get more expensive. When you do things like get rid of no-cause evictions, when you do things like get rid of short-term rentals, what you're going to have is landlords taking their property off the market, or they're going to sell it to some investor from out of state who doesn't care. You're going to have folks like us who, if we could sell our property, which we can't because the city's had us in court for 2.5 years for no good God-given reason. But if we wanted to, we would sell our property to leave because it's getting out of control and it's getting out of hand. And I have no safety or security in my property because you just keep giving away my rights to my property. So that house, our house, will be bought by an out-of-state investor who does not care. They're not going to rent units for below market rate to first responders and teachers so that they can live in the community. They're not going to care. They're not going to rent rooms to nurses and students at below market rate so that they can live in the community and not have to travel for hours to get to school and work and things like that. But that's something that we do. But if you make it impossible, if you make it so that it actually costs me money to own the property to where I'm actually paying for my tenants to live in my property, I'm not going to stay. So if the purpose is to drive out landlords so you can have some kind of, I don't know, like state supremacy or whatever, like you're trying to force good people out of the city of Burlington so you can take over our properties for some reason, I mean, you're doing a great job. If that is the goal, you're doing a really great job. What you are not doing is making it easier to be a landlord. So when you take away my ability to, as an example, not rent to people who are good and safe, not only are you putting me and my family at risk, but you're also putting my other tenants at risk. So you're not giving me full access to be able to manage my property in such a way that not only protects me and protects my property, but protects my other tenants. So if the city really genuinely wants to do what it says it wants to do, which is help housing be more affordable, the only thing, sincerely, the only thing that you can do is relieve some of the burdens, some of the regulations and the barriers to building more housing. That is the only thing that you can do. And if you think that more laws and regulations will make it cheaper and more affordable, you are wrong. And I strongly encourage you to do the research of even liberal economists who agree that these kinds of ordinances are very, very bad for communities. So just really dig in, really look at the data, and really be sincere about what the city can do rather than obfuscating the blame for making it too expensive to live here. It is not landlord's fault. It's not short-term rentals' fault. It's y'all's fault. And it's the people who came before you. And you're the only ones that actually have the power to do anything about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Kent Cass. Kent, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, actually, my name is Kent Casella, but for some
I'm
reason,
sorry.
I changed my name on here, so that's fine. Thanks for the opportunity to let me speak. Over the past year or so, there's been a lot of discussion about how to handle short-term rentals, and in many of the areas, the suggestions are pretty draconian, and in my opinion, they're overreaching. First, there was the staggering fee that was proposed, and then unit limits, all in the name of protecting affordable housing. Now, during all this time, the work was not done to determine how many short-term rentals have actually completely replaced the long-term housing in Burlington. Here we are, we're trying to regulate something that we don't have the accurate facts about. So recently, I've gotten even more concerned about the short-term rentals needing to be mostly owner-occupied. Here again, there's another proposal, another regulation for something that has not been shown to be a problem. Many of the Burlington hosts and other Vermont hosts rely on short-term rental as a supplemental or primary income. Imposing restrictions like these could and would cause serious financial hardship to many Burlingtonian hosts and taxpayers. I became a short-term rental host in my duplex that I've owned for 29 years, just over 5 years ago. I'd been working out of town for nearly 20 years and commuting back and forth to my home. And I decided I wanted to stay in Burlington full time. And I'd lost a considerable amount of money from a neglectful and irresponsible tenant in my duplex. So I decided to give short-term rental a try. I was hopeful that the short-term rental income would provide the money I needed to remain here. So I registered with the state. I paid all the meals and rooms taxes from day one and have not been disappointed. I've never had a police report or anything like that. I've had outstanding renters and guests. My property taxes, on the other hand, have tripled since I've owned my property. And I can't afford to stay in my home if I lose the income from the short-term rental. There was a recent survey done by the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance that learned that 38% of Vermont resident short-term rental owners said that short-term rental is their primary source of income. 38% of the Vermont resident short-term rental owners, their primary source of income is short-term rental. So how many Vermonters are we going to be willing to put out of business with these regulations? How many Burlingtonians? If you don't know the answer to this, then why would you move forward with any of these proposals? Are you comfortable reducing livelihoods of Burlingtonians? Because this is what the outcome of the proposal will be. This proposal removes job opportunities and will cause many people to lose their primary source of income right as we're coming out of the worst economic hardship we've ever had. We didn't make any money as short-term rentals during the pandemic. There was zero opportunity. There have been regulations for home ownership. These regulations could make home ownership in Burlington almost impossible. I've been approached many times to sell my house at a very significant profit, but I want to age in my home. I want to continue to live in Burlington through my retirement. People like me wouldn't be able to live comfortably and age comfortably at home if it weren't for the short-term rentals. And these regulations would really affect that. That's why I really request this committee that's done a lot of hard work, that you withdraw the current proposal, reconsider the impact these restrictions will have on your fellow community members. Let's get a formal and accurate registration implemented before you decide anything further. The numbers I've seen are not accurate. I know all the hosts that I've talked with and been associated with would like to be more involved in an open dialogue about the regulations, but please return to a discussion on how to regulate short-term rentals once you know how many people's livelihoods could be adversely affected. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next speaker is Jonathan Heller. There's a Jonathan that's on. Hopefully that's the right one.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I might be reading the regulations differently than other people, but I guess it's for a lawyer to read. So I'm just going to kind of read a statement I wrote. Hello, I'm a single parent, homeowner, and Airbnb host who finds the revenue from Airbnb to be a necessary source of income with less of an impact on the neighborhood than the multiple roommates that I previously had. I applaud a plan to establish fair and equitable regulations. There need to be clear regulatory framework that allows for people in my situation to utilize this revolutionary platform. Currently, the zoning is basically based on how well you get along with your neighbors, from my perspective. And it should not be. These decisions should be made in an even-handed and fair manner, and it should not be an issue that creates tension between neighbors. Airbnbs benefit homeowners with a source of income, guests who otherwise could not afford to visit Burlington, and the city and state with room and meals tax. So I applaud and support any regulation to clarify the situation with short-term rentals.
Thank you. The next speaker is Julia Marks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. For the record, this is Julie Marks speaking. I am a Burlington property owner, landlord, and the director of the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance. I'd like to start by acknowledging the time that everyone here tonight has put into this issue already. It's been an emotional topic that has come up at a very difficult time for all of us. Over 14 months ago, I first learned of the city's intent to reduce the number of short-term rentals in Burlington. I stood before you, the Planning Commission and Joint Committee, and asked you to delay this action. I asked you to wait until you had some data to justify your proposal, to wait until you had more information about how short-term rentals were actually impacting housing in Burlington, to wait until you would be able to measure the impacts of your proposals, to wait until you had evidence-based recommendations that would undeniably improve the economic and living conditions in the city of Burlington. I asked you to take pause and consider forming a committee to administer the data collection project that Burlington's 2019 Housing Summit report requested. Last year, the Planning Commission ignored the request and continued drafting regulations without objective and sufficient information to support its proposals. Today, I'm speaking to you as the director of VSTRA, the Vermont Short-Term Rental Alliance, and requesting that the Burlington Planning Commission withdraw these recommendations for being premature and because they will not accomplish the intended goals. The state legislature is close to passing its own regulations that would likely make much of these efforts duplicative, ineffective, and unduly burdensome. But I'll address that point more in a minute. One thing I think we can all celebrate is the announcement that Vermont has received over $1 million in additional funding for affordable housing construction under the American Rescue Plan Act. This grant includes $1.5 million for the city of Burlington. It's my understanding that these funds are intended for our most vulnerable, those unhoused or at risk of becoming homeless. And this is an unusual and wonderful opportunity to improve the housing situation in Burlington. The one critical fact that many of us do not agree on is whether short-term rentals have dramatically affected Burlington's affordable housing supply. I'd like to paraphrase Commissioner Josh Hanford of the Department of Housing and Community Development, who in a recent testimony suggested that Vermont hasn't seen a boom in housing construction proportionate to the demand since the 1980s. In other words, the principal reason why we're in a housing crunch may be because of a 40-year deficit in new housing construction and development, rather than short-term rentals. The housing crisis has long predated the onset of the short-term rental market. Income and wages have not kept pace with the rising overall cost of living in Burlington, not just with the cost of rental housing. A burdensome zoning code also hampers the housing supply from keeping pace with the growing demand. The 280 or so units in Burlington that now offer furnished temporary housing options and short-term visitor accommodations, the type of housing that is preferred by a growing number of visitors and seasonal workers nowadays, are actually enhancing the local economy, not harming it. I am suggesting that the recommendations put forth by the Planning Commission are extremely unlikely to make a noticeable dent in the housing affordability. In fact, they will probably result in the loss of jobs and undoubtedly the loss of livelihoods for many Vermont homeowners and mom and pop landlords during these difficult times. Governor Phil Scott has just committed substantial resources to developing new affordable housing in the coming years. This unprecedented commitment further undermines the rationale that we need to reduce the number of short-term rentals in order to provide more affordable housing. As I mentioned earlier, I'm requesting that the commission table its recommendations to regulate short-term rentals because the Senate Bill S79, an act related to improving rental housing and safety, is very likely to pass into law. This bill is supported by VSTRA and provides for a statewide of short-term rentals. It also provides for a housing investment program, making millions of dollars available to property owners so they can bring vacant buildings out of compliance back into the housing supply. The policies proposed in S79 will have a positive impact on housing. These recommendations, on the other hand, which would prohibit many homeowners and landlords from operating even one short-term rental, would severely reduce investments in properties, have inequitable impacts on property values, and unnecessarily reduce the city's meals and rooms tax revenue. Allowing the state to implement its registry for short-term rentals would save the city of Burlington precious resources, avoid confusion and duplication, and allow for the collection of information that could be later used to inform more targeted policies around regulating short-term rentals in Burlington. I'd like to remind the commission that short-term rentals are already regulated. They're regulated by the Department of Health, the Department of Public Safety's Division of Fire Safety, and the Department of Taxes. Short-term rentals are still rental housing units. Their use as a short-term rental is most often temporary and sporadic. All other times, they're still housing. And please remember that many of the whole unit STRs in Burlington were never long-term rentals before. Chopping the already small number of STRs in Burlington in half without fact-based justification is a risk. While I understand your desire to do something about short-term rentals in Burlington, I think for now, doing nothing is the most prudent course of recommendations. Even if the responsibility ultimately shifts to the minimum housing ordinances, I hope the Planning Commission will not endorse these specific recommendations for further consideration. The state will very likely pass S79 into law this summer and require all STRs to register, thus establishing a comprehensive database that will reveal the true nature and impacts of short-term rentals and release millions of dollars towards creating thousands of new housing options. I urge you to please make the decision to avoid duplication, save the city money, and allow for data-driven policy to be developed at a more opportune time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Lucas Jensen. You should be able to unmute, Lucas.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. My name is Lucas Jensen. I am a Vermont resident and a longtime, small-time landlord in Burlington. Of the 4 buildings I own, I use only one of them as a short-term rental, which is a building I had a very hard time renting to long-term tenants and had several bad experiences that were quite costly to deal with. I have found the ST market to be a lifeline, allowing me to pay for needed maintenance and invest in improvements of not only that property, but of the others I own as well, all while keeping the rents I charge to most of my long-term tenants at or below market values. The recommendations of this committee were moved forward with haste. It was very clear in the last meeting that fatigue has set in and that this committee is not willing to put in the hard work to figure out a truly progressive solution that fairly addresses the needs of the city, property owners, and tenants. A policy that you can be proud of to say represents the principles of our great city. I ask that these recommendations are withdrawn and that discussions within the Planning Commission continue to that end. Critical steps have been skipped, including confirming that these recommendations will meet the stated objectives of this committee and careful consideration of the unintended consequences they may have. The likely impacts of these recommendations are unknown and have not been meaningfully debated. The unintended consequences have not been fully vetted or weighed, and the guiding objective set by the Housing Summit Report has not been achieved. Questions that must be answered before these recommendations go any further include: who will benefit from these recommendations and how? How many of us will be harmed and to what extent? How will tenants be affected? Will these recommendations make housing more affordable in Burlington? I, for one, will have to raise rents on my several long-term rentals, which I haven't done in 3 years, which I haven't raised rent in 3 years now if I am no longer allowed to participate in the short-term rental market. How much will the city lose in rooms and meals tax, and what will this loss of income affect? How will the decline in tourism caused by the reduced number of short-term rentals affect the restaurants and businesses in the city who rely on that foot traffic from tourists? It has been explained that the benefit of using Chapter 18 to regulate short-term rentals is the flexibility of being able to adjust limits annually. What is the process for evaluating these limits? What are the benchmarks to indicate you've gone too far or not far enough? How will changes to the limits be made going forward, and by whom? These recommendations need more work. I know a better job can be done. Please do not move them forward to the City Council without first completing the critical steps of determining the impact of what you are recommending and making adjustments so that we have a plan that works for the city, property owners, and tenants. I also just wanted to add to this, and this is something that continually gets skipped over, but this, there was no mention in your summary that minimum housing inspections wouldn't be required in 1 or 2 bedroom partial unit short-term rentals. And that's something that I have an issue with, because as a short-term rental host, my concern is providing a safe place for the public to stay, and that these 1 or 2 unit partial unit rentals are not going to be required to have safety inspections, I think is an issue that should be further discussed. That's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Amy Magyar.
Thanks, Megan. I just wanted to let you all know, just to give you a sense of timing, that this will probably be a little under 3 minutes, a little over 2 minutes. You've heard me speak a lot over the last 18 months, and Lucas used the term fatigue. I'm hoping if you'll just give me a little bit more attention tonight and make this worth your while. I ask you tonight to consider how the city will replace not only the loss of meals and room tax revenue, but money spent on tourism, local businesses, and jobs if Burlington's ability to house guests is reduced. I don't have to remind you of what we've all just lived through and are still living through. A global pandemic that brought industry and trade powerhouses such as tourism and hospitality to its knees. And with it, economic ruin or crisis, not only to individuals, but to municipalities. We believe that short-term rental hosts can be a source of Burlington's economic recovery in 2021 and beyond. We are a town for tourists. We have always been, but even more important is how the city structures itself to make a robust recovery moving forward as a town for tourists. We believe we can be a part of bringing tourism, Vermont's second largest revenue generator, back to life. But it's not just hosts that believe they can make a difference in the economic recovery. Recently, in a National League of Cities 2020 article on why short-term rentals matter to reopening cities, the NLC begged leaders of municipalities to view short-term rentals as an asset in helping their economies to recuperate. It's estimated that Vermont's tourism industry grew to about 2.8 billion and supported 32,000 jobs in recent years. We know that those numbers have been threatened, but have a chance to not only come back, but roar back in 2021 and beyond. The Vermont Department of Tourism and Marketing released Vermont's tourism benchmark study, sharing 13 million people visit Vermont each year, bringing 2.8 billion into the state. The industry supports 32,000 jobs, or nearly 10% of the state's workforce. The tourism sector contributed $391 million into tax revenue, which provides a reduction of $1,450 for every Vermont household. Governor Scott mentioned the tourism benchmark study confirms what we've intuitively known. Tourism is vital to growing in our economy. Tourists visit all corners of our state, spending money on fuel, dining, lodging, and our quality Vermont products. These visitors are essential to strengthening our local economies and rural communities. What's interesting is how pre-pandemic tourism has boomed in Vermont, in Burlington specifically. However, there's been little growth in hotel rooms to match the tourism boom. Much of the growth is because of short-term rentals. No place to stay, day trippers spend significantly less during a visit monetarily than overnight visitors. Beyond the direct spending on short-term rentals, overnight visitors spend on their accommodations. They spend money elsewhere in the economy, which in turn has a ripple or multiplying effect. A few facts on that ripple. 35% of Airbnb guests report that without short-term rentals, they would either have not traveled at all or they would have shortened their trip. On average, short-term rental guests stay 2.1 times longer and spend 1.8 times more than typical visitors. In addition to changing how guests travel, short-term rentals have changed where guests stay when they travel. By staying in less concentrated neighborhoods, short-term rental guests distribute the economic impacts of travel to neighborhoods that have not traditionally received the benefits of the tourism industry. As an example, the Old North End is not a hotspot for hotels, but it actually has become a really incredible place for short-term rentals, where money is being spent at places like Butch and Babes and all the amazing restaurants that are there. Lastly, the revenue generated by short-term rentals is reinvested into local communities, whereas hotel profits may go directly back to headquarters. Hosts keep money in the area. Hang in there with me, I'm almost done. Short-term rentals are not new. They've been supporting Vermont's economy for 70 plus years. As long as there's been mountains to climb, ski or ride on, there have been homes and camps rented out to visitors. Platforms like Airbnb and VBRO have actually ensured that meals and rooms taxes are collected. We want to be part of the solution to bring Burlington's economy not just back to normal, but flourishing. How people travel will be different when we get to the next normal of post-pandemic. What they spend, how they spend, not traveling as much internationally is going to be an enormous part of how Burlington can actually gain economic impact in tourism and beat out some other cities. If we don't do it, there's a chance that Winooski and South Burlington may actually get our sleepover people because we have reduced the number of short-term rentals. I want to remind you tonight that each host uses a platform such as Airbnb and VBRO so that we must pay our room and meals taxes. We can't get out of it. In fact, it isn't even an option to not pay. So on top of our annual property taxes, which for me are a little over $7,000, some hosts are paying up to an additional $10,000 in additional taxes for hosting through meals and rooms taxes. So in a sense, if I was able to make $10,000, if I was able to generate $10,000 in meals and rooms taxes, along with my $7,000 in revenue, or excuse me, in taxes, that's $17,000 my home is generating for the city. Is this committee ready to restrict who can be a short-term rental host and risk not knowing how that will affect the city's economy? I wouldn't want to make that guess based on comments in a housing summit. I would want to make that determination based on facts. With new state legislation proposed, S79, hosts will get registered. And then perhaps the city can determine recommendations and allow Vermont to take the lead on gathering data on STRs, then make decisions based on data. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Deb Lyons.
Hi there. Thank you, Megan. Although there has been much discussion and movement on short-term rental recommendations, I am again returning to my request that this committee eliminate the requirement that mandates primary owner occupancy for single and duplex rental buildings when short-term renting. I understand the need to strengthen the housing market for renters. I wish the city provided support and incentives to landlords to remain in the long-term housing market. And I'm glad that there are projects on the table that will expand housing in Burlington and nearby towns in the coming months and year. I also understand that some landlords have moved into the short-term rental market because of major traumatic events with long-term tenants. Such was the case for me. Excuse me. Luckily, I've been able to find a balance in offering my rental for both short and long-term tenants, meeting many different family and community workers' needs. Basically, I can offer a furnished, registered, and inspected safe home for a temporary length of time to those who cannot commit to a one-year rental lease. This is a need in Burlington. It is certainly a lot more work for me, and honestly, hardly much more than a year's worth of income from an annual contract. But I find this option much more secure and safe in terms of the care and responsibility shown to my property. I rely on the income I receive from short-term renting to afford my home and make ends meet, including paying my city taxes, which of note will be increasing significantly as the property assessment I received just yesterday went up over 100%. But in regards to the recommendations you have put forward to this public hearing, I believe a landlord should be allowed to permit their building for STR, whether they live on site or if they are 5 blocks away or in another town. I request that you return this to committee to discuss the proposal suggested last month, allowing property owners who don't live on site but have owned a building for 3 or more years to short-term rent. This is a balanced approach to the concerns of widespread turnover of LTRs to STRs. It takes into account the goal to support long-term rentals and the viewpoints and stories of us small landlords who are trying to make ends meet in an increasingly costly town. Andy's proposal last month was feasible, simple, and practical. I'd even say it was a progressive suggestion that is a fair attempt to achieve a path that both supports housing for renters and allows an off-site host or owner to rent their property as an STR if they so choose. It's a win-win compromise and one that this city could certainly use more of. I encourage you to take this up in committee again, and per the other suggestions made prior to me, to pause and wait and see what S79 does at the state level to help gather the information that is needed for this kind of decision. So thank you for seriously considering this option and going back to committee. Thanks.
Okay, I also now see Jacob Hinsdale has his hand raised. If anyone else that's here that didn't contact me before wants to speak, please raise your hand or leave a message in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, so I'm Jacob Hinsdale. I'm a property manager in Burlington. I wanted to just weigh in and express, I want to express concern at the premise of what I see as sort of a false choice between short-term rentals and long-term rentals. Based on my experience in the rental market, the people that do short-term renting offer and commit a lot more work to the properties than people doing long-term renting on a day-to-day basis. There's just, as a practical matter, a lot more labor you have to mix into the property, turning it over, and not to mention providing it and maintaining furniture and even linens and towels in some situations for short-term rentals, which is just, a tremendous amount of work compared to the amount of work that a long-term rental agency has to put into each building. I, as a property manager of mostly 12-month rented places, almost entirely, do a lot of rental upkeep day to day. But if the properties were turning over even on a monthly basis, I would not be able to do what I do. I would have to probably increase the staff we have by an order of magnitude just to keep up with even monthly turnovers. So I just don't see, speaking personally, I don't see it likely ever for any large landlords to en masse convert to short-term rentals. Just as a practical matter, there's not enough labor in Burlington or Chittenden County to accommodate any amount of conversion that would impact the housing market. I've had an ad up for maintenance help for months now, and really it can't find people that want to do the work, even just to find one person. So, and the people that live in one home and own maybe one more home and have the time to commit to turning places over and providing that service, I don't understand why they should be restricted if they don't just happen to not live in that property from providing that service and mixing their labor with the property, as should be their right if they have the time to do it. I think the incidence of that, if there were data on this, I don't think would impact the overall availability of long-term rentals for Burlingtonians. So I want to echo what many folks have said before me, and I particularly want to echo what Deb Lyons said and Mr. Cassidy said, that there just should be more. There should be more data. There should be reflection about what's coming from the state level, and I believe that this action from this committee is premature. Thank you very much.
Okay, that is all that I see for the public hearing.
Okay, thank you, Megan. So I'm just double checking to see if there is anybody else. All right, no one else raising their hand, Megan?
Nope, nobody else. Sorry, I
Okay.
just did get a question in the chat that I want to respond to, just so everybody knows. If the committee decides tonight that they would like to refer any part of this recommendation to the city council, there will need to be a vote taken in order to do that. If the committee continues to just work on it and wants to make changes, they're not required to take votes on any of those changes that they make if they're not referring it on as a formal action. Andy, there is a request here that somebody would like the committee to vote if they make any changes tonight. So that's up to you. It's not something that's required, but it's up to you and the committee about how you want to handle that.
Okay, great, thank you. And thanks to all who spoke tonight, and we will close the public hearing portion and move back to the commission and council, the ordinance committee. Comments, questions from the commission? Jack?
Yeah, I'll just add a comment about the 5-bedroom limit. I'm not sure that we've discussed that, or I don't remember discussing it, but that seems a little high in terms of being potentially exploited as sort of a loophole, I guess, to this. If you're allowing 5 bedrooms, could someone just set up a living premises or even build new in such a way that there's just 5 Airbnb bedrooms connected to a main building? Or maybe staff can speak to that, but I just want to make sure we're not creating a loophole with that.
I can answer that, I hope. So that's an existing standard, Jack. that comes from the existing zoning standards for bed and breakfast. And with a little more detail in the low density residential zone, the limit's actually 3. In all other zones, it's 5 bedrooms. But in any scenario, it's tied to the host's dwelling unit. So it couldn't be set up as a 5-bedroom short-term rental and all 5 bedrooms are rented out to short-term guests. It has to be your residence that has, I guess in this case, 6 bedrooms in order to have that 5. So
That,
an existing standard.
right, that was intended to bring the current model of bed and breakfast into this kind of overall proposal.
Okay, so it's more of a literal bed and breakfast at that point, I guess.
It could take the form of a, somebody who just wants to rent 1 bedroom in their home, or it could take the more traditional form of a bed and breakfast.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Anyone else? Jennifer?
So I've been thinking about the issue of the 3-year ownership that you raised last time, Andy, and I don't know if you're willing to sort of reopen that conversation, but I do agree that that could be a potential compromise. I understand that there may be longtime homeowners that move out of the city and convert their home, but I do think that it is challenging to run an Airbnb when you're offsite. And I do think that it is a way to sort of stem speculative, turnover in the city for people just buying stuff up, not living here, and then Airbnb-ing it. So I have been thinking about it, and I think that could be an opportunity to offer a compromise for people that have lived for a while in Burlington, have owned their properties for a while, and to have that as an option. So I just wanted to reopen that conversation if people are open to that. I've thought about it and I feel like I could support that. So I wanted to put that back on the table if people are interested in that conversation.
Okay. I mean, obviously I'm interested, but keep going. Bruce?
Jennifer, you said exactly what I would have said. I think we've struck a balance in the matrix that's heavily solicitous of the housing stock. And my view of that matrix is going to be dependent on the outcome of the debate over Andy's 3-year proposal and how we handle helping those that have invested in our city and taking good care of these properties and our smaller landlords who are trying to support their incomes. These are jobs.
Thanks. Let's keep going around. Emily and then Zariah, I see you too.
I brought this up last time and I'll bring it up again. My issue with allowing the 3 years is I just don't see people ever stopping doing Airbnb. And I'm not sure why having owned a property for 3 years makes you any more justified to be able to do it. I think it concentrates wealth in homeowners, people who have enough money to buy these properties and live in those owner occupies, gives them a further benefit of being a landowner that I don't know why somebody who's a new landowner in Burlington shouldn't have the same economic benefit as someone else. So if you're rising up if you're economically upwardly mobile, you have a greater burden than somebody who has entrenched wealth in Burlington. And I don't think that's very progressive. And I would support something that was transitional if there was like a year limit. If you own a house for 3 years, you need to Airbnb it for a year while you're transitioning to something else. I could understand that. Myself, I own a house in Burlington. If this proposal passed, I would be incentivized to buy another house in Burlington and then Airbnb my old house because I could make a lot of money doing that. And that's one house in Burlington that won't be rented to a new family that's moving to Burlington.
Zariah?
Yeah, I'm similarly, I don't like the 3-year proposal. I don't understand how that is a good compromise. Like I would like it does just, it's speaking of entrenchment. I agree that having something else where it's like if you're already operating an Airbnb, like not enforcing that for a year while we are, you know, like registering other folks is something that makes sense to me, but saying, you know, you've been doing this. Again, this is currently not an allowed use. Everything that we're not allowing in our proposal is currently not allowed. We're not taking anything away from anyone. And I think entrenching folks who own property already and saying you are somehow of higher value to us than newcomers, it does seem really regressive to me. I just want to say, I guess, speak to a few things that were made in public comment as well, which is the waiting. I don't mean to speak too much because I know that this will go to city council and I have another crack at it as well. But I do think waiting is not a great idea. I think first of all, I have as much faith in the state process solving Burlington specific problems as maybe some of the callers did. But also I've just seen folks come to the development review board because, you know, their neighbors don't like that they have an Airbnb and then they get shut out completely. So there's also people on the other side who are waiting for this to pass so that they can legally have an Airbnb. And so I would encourage us to not wait. I think we've already waited a very long time. Just want to remind folks also that, like, as we're talking about keeping people in their homes or keeping Burlingtonians in Burlington, we are basically allowing almost anything that you want to do in your own home or in a building that you live in. If you own a duplex, if you own a triplex, if you own a fourplex and you're living in it, you get to short-term rent it. This isn't a disallowal of anything that someone wants to do in the building that they live in, like almost exclusively. So I feel like I just have to call that out because I think we're being quite as saying, if this is really your home, you get to do a lot, you have a lot of leeway with that. And if it's not your home and it's an investment property, then we're going to regulate that differently. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So I really like the current proposal. I would be willing to discuss loosening up the current proposal in some other ways. I think the 3-year rule is very aggressive to me and I would not support that.
So let me just speak for a moment on that one and where I came up with it. Personally, and thanks for raising that issue. Personally, would be very supportive of allowing single-family dwelling units and duplexes, one unit in a duplex, to be used as an Airbnb, regardless of whether the property owner lives there or not. I think in terms of our rental stock, that's not where the issue really is. The issue really comes in with the larger units. And those are the ones that we're protecting. So I would be happy to just say that for the single detached dwelling unit and the duplexes, that there doesn't have to be a time limit where you own it for a certain amount of, I would just go ahead and say it would be fine for someone who doesn't live in those buildings, but who owns them to be able to use them for short-term rental. Because I do think it's fair to do it that way. The reason I suggested the 3-year time was because there is a concern, as I understand it, that people might be buying properties specifically for the purpose of turning them into short-term rentals. And so this way, putting some time limit on, where you'd have to own it for at least a short period of time before you could do it, would be a disincentive perhaps for people to buy a property for the sole purpose of turning it into a short-term rental. But if there's a concern that would be regressive, and I understand that, I sort of agree with that, then I would just say, we don't need the 2 or 3 year period. Just if you own a duplex or a single family dwelling, not as part of a larger unit, but just, a single family house, whether you live there or not, I think you should be able to have that as a short-term rental. So I could go either way. I could go either with the with a short-term rental for a single family house where, you know, from the moment you own it, you could do it. I could also go, if there's concerns about it being where somebody might just buy a house for that reason. I'm also happy to do it with a 2 or 3 year requirement before they could do it. But I also will not be supporting this without something like that, because I think the harm that we'll be bringing to people who, right now, people like Deb Lyons, I think the harm is so great that our whole goal here is to make it more possible for people to be living in homes. And by doing this, by taking away a major source of income for people, I fear that people like Deb Lyons will not be able to stay in their house anymore. And I know there are counter arguments to say, but some people may, you know, be getting the single family homes for the purpose of turning them into short-term rentals. But for me, that's a speculation that may or may not happen if we do this, because it's in the minimum housing code. We could always change the code. You know, perhaps our initial code that we do, we say is interim code, interim for a year or two, as we see just what the full impact of it is. But the harm is so great, as I see it, to people like Deb Lyons, that I won't support this without some kind of the ability for people like her to rent out the homes that they don't necessarily live in. Eves, is that your hand up?
Yeah, that's me. I agree with you completely, Andy. I mean, if you listen to the people who are calling in and telling us how they feel and what they want, the message is extraordinarily consistent. It's not from people who are saying, oh, I want to be able to have, 25 short-term rentals. These are tax-paying citizens who are trying to find ways to be able to stay in their homes with an increasingly expensive city demand on them. And it's just logic. So I'm really, I completely agree with you. That I also agree that if the goal is to prevent speculation, then the time limit of, you got to wait at least 3 years before you do it, I think that's actually fair as well. Because what you're doing then is you are trying in a direct way to prevent speculation. But again, we've heard so consistently on these public forums from people saying, look, I'm doing this so I can pay my taxes. I'm doing this so I can keep my house nicely kept up. I'm doing this so I can keep up with the property maintenance. I'm doing this so that I can remain there. I'm doing this so I can homeschool my child. We need to do this. And we need to allow these citizens to be able to supplement their income so they can stay in their homes. It's that simple.
Chip? You're on mute.
Thank you.
You're back on mute again.
Sorry about that. My incompetency. I want to speak first to the public comment, and we heard much public comment on, pulling this or request to pull this back, or request to slow it down. And ultimately, while it's the Planning Commission's decision what to do, I would actually encourage. I think we've all sat through multiple meetings. I think we're at a point where we're hearing the same comments. And while I appreciate there's a little bit of nuance in terms of where it goes, I do think it would benefit from being moved on to the full council with a different set of eyes, and moving it forward. And I also think, with all due respect, as we come out of the pandemic, my fear in not doing something is more people, as we've seen, might move into this short-term rental market and then feel this sense of entitlement, such that it makes it even more difficult to make changes. As a matter of policy, I won't get into it other than to articulate my position. I too support either, what Andy is advocating of, no owner occupied requirement for single family homes and duplexes. I also agree that the 3-year potential window would tampen down on speculation, which I think is a good thing. I also need to sort of pull back every now and then as to, I appreciate that does entrench a certain population, but we often forget that all we're precluding is short-term rental. I mean, the housing is still available to be rented. This is not a, no income or short-term rental. It's, are you allowed? We all make an assumption that the income is higher via a short-term rental than one. And I appreciate from some of the commenters that spoke today, that's subject to debate. but I think it's fair that that's a baseline assumption of what most on this committee agree. And we're not taking away the ability to make an income. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we go to second rounds, is there anybody else for the first round? Okay, Emily, back to you.
I wanted to echo something that Chip said, and that is that if you own an investment property, you have the ability to sell the property. So if you have a second house, real estate values are up over 25%. Everyone just got their reassessment, right? And real estate in Burlington is up a lot. And you can sell a property and you can invest it in something else that also makes income. It doesn't have to be a rental. I've rented out rooms in my house for more than 30 days for many years to traveling nurses and people who are moving to Burlington. And it is as close to as lucrative as short-term rental. And there is so much demand for people who are coming to work in Burlington for more than 30 days. So I would offer that as an excellent way to transition short-term rentals to longer-term rentals. And then anecdotally, I wanted to share that I heard, this last month, there's the Free Press building that was just turned over a few years ago, renovated and made into apartments, which used to be offices. And those apartments are generally one-bedroom apartments, and they are what I would consider to be affordable and located right downtown. I've had many friends that have lived there, and those apartments, the people who I knew lived there were all people who worked in Burlington in restaurants and in retail in downtown, did not have cars, and paid an affordable amount of money to live and work in Burlington. And I just heard that almost all of those apartments have become short-term rentals. So all of those people who used to have an affordable apartment to live and work in Burlington, who are low-income people, who are the people who wait on your tables, work at the store, students who are going to UVM, can't live in a walkable location without a car in Burlington because those units have become de facto hotels. So those people have not showed up to the meeting to talk about how they've lost their housing because of short-term rentals because they no longer live in Burlington. So I think that if these are currently not permitted, and if we allow them to be permitted, I think that the numbers are going to go up and you're going to see more loss of workforce housing in Burlington.
Just on that, if I could just check with Megan or Scott. My understanding is because in the old Free Press building, that's a larger apartment or unit complex that they wouldn't be allowed to do short-term rentals unless they own the property itself or live in the property itself, live in the unit itself. Is that right?
And under this proposal, the only way that a short-term rental could be in that building is if it is the host's actual unit.
I know there's people who are renting there. It's actually not being rented by the owner of the building. People have been, there's been some people renting out multiple apartments to Airbnb them.
So then, Emily, are you suggesting, are you proposing that we do away with that provision that says people who live in a unit could do a short-term?
They're not renting out their own unit. They're leasing multiple apartments. So they're paying rent for multiple apartments. Regardless if it's allowed in that unit or not, there is a huge demand for short-term rentals in the downtown core of Burlington. And regardless if it's a 5-unit, a 10-unit, a 2-unit, a 1-unit, every single unit that's a short-term rental in Burlington's downtown core used to house someone who lived and worked in Burlington.
So I'll just pipe in and say that it's in the downtown and lodging is allowed in any event. So it doesn't have to fit inside the short-term rental box to be that.
But, and then also to me highlights that the units I'm talking about, the single family units or the duplexes, those aren't in the downtown. Those are scattered around in other parts of the city. And those are the ones that, from where we stand right now, those are the ones that I'm most concerned about, because those are the ones I think, if we don't allow them to be used as short-term rentals, for some people, like, I'll use Deb Lyons again, she's one who's been here like throughout this time, we're going to basically be kicking her out of her home is what my worry is. So
So can I weigh in just briefly, Andy?
Sure.
Just really as to administration and enforcement. So I'll state the obvious here. It's a lot cleaner and simpler to allow offsite hosting or not, rather than go with a 3 to 4 year ownership standard. But of course, I'll defer to the committee on that. You know, we've talked about this before. There are questions around what is ownership, what degree of ownership are we talking about, and how do we prove the tenure of ownership, right? It adds complexity in terms of administration and enforcement. And something else that we had talked about previously that led us away from allowing offsite for single family and duplexes was that in terms of Burlington's housing supply pie, single family homes and duplexes are both fairly small components. By far the largest piece of that housing pie is multifamily, which is what led us to allow the offsite hosting for multifamily. But more recently, that was refined down to just 3 and 4 unit buildings because of the 5 unit threshold, where it basically becomes a commercial property. Oh, and Deb Lyons is the happy recipient of a permit to have a short-term rental recently, so she's all set in that respect.
I have
So
Zariah.
she's going to get to keep doing it?
Going to go to Zariah and then come to David. So
Yeah,
Zariah.
this is more just a point of clarification because I keep hearing us say that we don't want people to lose their home when they can't rent it as a short-term rental. They can always rent their home as a short-term rental. So I don't know why we keep saying we don't want people to lose their home for not being able to rent it as a short-term rental when we are very explicitly always allowing that.
Sure. Let me, that's a good point. Let me just clarify what I mean by that. What we've heard from people, and I'll continue to use Deb as the example, but what we've heard from people is that's the income that they use to be able to afford the home that they do live in. And that's, I mean, I could be wrong on that, but that's the way I'm understanding it. So that's what I mean by that when I say that.
Right. And then the second, I am not I definitely feel like there's still some, and ultimately I'm not going to say a lot more because I think this is the planning commission's meeting and I will have another crack at it. So whatever you all send to us, I want you all to do what you all want to do. But I do think that to another extent, it's like having something like a 1 year, you get a year to figure it out. We will have data for that 1 year, which is what everybody's been asking for. I just don't, if you own a second property just in Burlington, that is a duplex or single family home, that is not an insignificant investment. It is quite an investment it is wealth. It is an enormous amount of wealth that you have that is separate from the home that you live in. And for us to say that we want to make sure that people have access to not just to keeping this wealth, which of course we want them to keep if it's been in the family, they don't necessarily want to sell it, but that we also want them to unconditionally be allowed to short-term rent it. I'm not super opposed to like opening it up to duplex and single family units. I think that was actually something I heard from other people on the committee, that they wanted that to be a restriction, but it's just the logic of why we're removing it just doesn't, I just don't completely understand it, is all that I have to say.
David?
Thank you, Andy. I was just going to really reiterate what Zariah just mentioned, that in these conversations, we tend to forget about the notion that any host can rent up to 5 rooms as a partial unit, and any host can rent the entirety of their residence, their primary residence, for up to like 182 days a year. So when concerning about somebody being able to generate some additional revenue to be able to stay in their home, we have to always keep in mind we've kind of set that as a foundation. So we're talking about really investment properties and investment property owners when we're discussing whether or not a host should be their primary residence.
Jack?
Yeah, I would echo that as well. I mean, I think when we talk about let's gather data and let's see, to me, that's the data, because even in that world where we're completely allowing short-term rentals for anyone who is in the building, there's still a negative externality of that on the rental housing market in Burlington and on driving up the cost of living for renters and reducing availability. So even that has its negative impact, but at least we're able to gather that data, understand that impact, and then decide if we want to loosen it. So I still really believe that we shouldn't, on top of that, open up the opportunity to people who own an investment property within Burlington, which, as Zariah said, that's a significant asset if you just own an entire property in Burlington that you don't even live in. And I understand that folks in that position would lose out on some ability to make profit because they might have to long-term rent instead of short-term rent. But that's exactly the trade-off that we're talking about, is that, yeah, they might make less money, but that leaves an additional long-term rental housing unit on the market, so that a tenant who does live in Burlington or would live in Burlington if they could access that rental unit can have housing in Burlington. So I just think we're sort of distorting the economic reality when we ignore tenants who make up over 60% of the city, and really just focus on the economic losses of folks who own a property in Burlington that they don't live in, which is a small category of people. And many of those people actually don't live in Burlington.
Harris, and then Alex.
Yes. Well, let's see. I want to thank everyone, all the participants who have stuck with us for so long. I hear what you're saying, Jack. That it is a good chunk of wealth, but it's really a business. That's basically what it is. And there's a whole variety of types of businesses in Burlington, and this is one of them. And it's a new one, that never fell under the regulations because it's a new, relatively new type of business, and that shouldn't prevent it, necessarily from being able to happen. And I know we're not totally preventing it, but there should be a way. I don't think it's right for people who have been participating in this type of business to have that taken away because they don't fit in the right category necessarily. And I kind of liken it to when we looked at the brewing, the beverage industry, and how that's changed. It just has, and it didn't fit under our old zoning, and so we had to deal with that. And there are problems with that industry too, mainly stormwater. But we just kind of changed the ordinance to fit the industry rather than the other way around. So I understand the impacts of taking away long-term rentals, and I think we've done an okay job at addressing this. I do not like the fact that a lot of people who have enjoyed the flexibility of this kind of a business are not going to be able to anymore. So I guess those are my feelings.
Thank you. Alex.
I got some jets flying overhead, so it might get loud. I just, this process has been, I think, extraordinarily taxing for a lot of people, and talking about us and the participants, but who we haven't heard from are the people who are looking for housing in Burlington, who can't find it, who have to leave Burlington and commute longer or leave the state or whatever. There's a planning commission, we have to consider all of the people, not just the people who we have a process now that works for some people. And our job is to consider the whole city for the long term. So I'm on the side of trying to preserve more long-term housing, however we can do it, because our housing crisis is so acute. That's generally my feeling. So that's what I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Does anyone? Who is that?
Eves has his hand up.
Oh, Eves. Sorry, I didn't see you.
I just want to say, I'm sorry if you can't hear me well, because I've got the F-35s taking off, which is a nightly occurrence. But I just took the liberty. I want to address what Emily said about the Free Press building. I took the liberty of texting Joe Handy, who's the owner, and asking him point blank, they are doing no short-term rentals at that building. They are all annual tenancies. He said, look, maybe a couple of the tenants are doing it, but it's not us. So for what it's worth, just to set the record straight.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? How do people want to move forward or not move forward, as the case might be? Bruce?
I think Soraya's point about, and I think Chip said it also, that city council is the ultimate decision maker. And it feels to me like planning commission at least may have a majority, but city council may have a different opinion of it later. And I think we've sort of gotten to a medical end result in terms of how we feel about it after a year of debate. And I would support pushing some version of Andy's proposal forward as a supplement to what we do in the matrix. And then let city council weigh in.
Jennifer?
Andy, I was just wanting some clarification on your proposal about allowing offsite hosting for single family homes and duplexes. I'm not actually sold on that. I think it should be owner occupied. So just wondering if you could explain a little bit more your thinking on that, because I'm not sure that I follow it completely.
Sure. So I start with the idea that for the smaller units, the single family or the duplexes, for one of the units in a duplex, that the owners of those buildings should have a lot of flexibility in what they use those buildings for, whether they live in them, whether they rent them out for long term, whether they rent them out for short term, or whether during the course of the year they do all three. That for those type of units, that I think we would do best with our housing in Burlington if people had the flexibility, because I think over time in some of these units, people might do short-term rental. They may live there for a while, and they may very easily, during some of the seasons, rent it out for several months or more at a time. And, as we've heard, there is, I think, a really big market for, the medium-term rental, I'll call it, the ones that are 30, 60, 90 days, a few months of people who are here temporarily. And so giving people flexibility to do that, I think ultimately in the smaller units, in the single families and in the duplexes, will give us the ability to have actually more housing on the rental stock, because I think it gives those small unit owners a lot of flexibility in how they do it. So, for that reason, and also for the reason of, I just think people in these, I don't think the single family dwelling units are that major of a problem in dealing with our housing issues. I think it's the larger units where the bulk of our housing is located and the bulk of our rental housing is located. That's where, I'm concerned, frankly, that we don't have enough of it. And I think all of us share that concern. So to me, I want to give the smaller properties, the single families, the duplexes, a lot more flexibility. I want to keep the larger units, the multi-unit ones, more restricted just for the long-term rentals or home ownership, if for the condos, but to have those be the owner occupied, the people that actually live in them. And for me, I just don't want to hold the hands of the single family units or the duplexes, and want to give them the flexibility that they need. And I think that will benefit everyone. I think the balance that we have here, it's not just looking at any particular unit, but I think the balance that we have is working to preserve and advance our housing stocks. So the question comes in then, how do we implement it? To me, how do we implement it for the single family or the duplexes? And as I said, I'd be open to just saying blanket that they can be used in, any housing way that the owner wants to, whether it's the long-term, short-term, owner occupied, however they want to do is fine. And if we want to say you need to have at least, a 2 or 3 year ownership before you can start using it for short-term rentals, just to take out the speculative nature of, keeping people from buying homes specifically to turn them into short-term rentals, I'd be very open to that as well. And frankly, I'm open for all of our rules on short-term rentals to call them interim rules for like a year or 2 years, so we can collect the data that we've all been talking about. And so we really can see exactly on each of these different elements what the impact is, because right now we don't have any of that data, nor is it really realistic for us to get it, because all we're dealing with are a lot of people who right now may have short-term rentals, but don't have to register, so we don't know who they are. This whole set of rules, the number one requirement is that people have to register. And so that now we'll know who they are, and in a year or two, we'll know what the impact of every element of our rules are and can make adjustments from there if needed. So again, I've heard folks say, particularly at our last meeting, maybe we hold off enforcing any of the rules for a year or something. And what we may want to do instead is call our rules interim rules, so we can actually require people to get registered, and then we could see what the impact is and know from empirical data rather than just thinking about it. But that's why I'm in favor of allowing single family dwelling units and duplexes to be used, among other things, as short-term rentals, regardless of where the owner lives.
And Andy, would that come back to planning commission in a year or so? Or would that
Probably
be a
not,
different
because
thought?
it's the rules. And so the housing code, unless the city council would like us to weigh in on it, that would probably stay with the city council. And, it has been pointed out, whatever we do tonight, is going to the city council, and they will do, their job then is to take what we bring to them, and they will make their, accept or make whatever changes they want to make. And that's part of the process, which is the way it should be. Megan?
So just a clarification on how the concept of interim rules could work when the bulk of what the structure of this regulation is in Chapter 18. We had previously talked about the fact that statute allows for an interim zoning process, but because these details don't live in zoning, that wouldn't necessarily be a way that we would move this forward. I think if the committee supported the idea of calling these rules interim, it would be just a recommendation to the city council when you forward it to them that they may address as part of their resolution to adopt the ordinance. I don't think it would be something that's formally codified in any of the rules, but that could stipulate kind of what the mechanism is that the city would use to evaluate the rules as part of that resolution.
Yeah, thanks for that clarity, Megan. That's more or less what my goal is. When I'm suggesting interim rules, what I'm suggesting is that it be put out there in front, and for however the rules might ultimately be adopted, that it be put out there right up front that in a year or 2 years, the council is going to re-examine them and make sure that they're working the way we want them to work. So however it might be called, but just to be clear, because I know there's a concern that once you adopt rules, it's hard to change them. But if right up front you say, odds are pretty good that they're going to get changed in a year or two because we're going to revisit them, then everyone would be on notice. But thanks for that clarification. Anyone else? So again, is there a motion or a proposal to move forward with? Anyone?
Is it useless to ask how this would go over at city council? I'm asking, Jack and Zariah and Chip, too speculative. We have to decide what we decide here.
No,
Please.
Chip and Jack. But Chip,
I'm not sure what you meant, Alex, in terms of how it would go over. I certainly have no understanding of how the council as a whole is going to move, how it will vote. But from a process perspective, it would go before the full council for first read. Input would be provided. I don't know, honestly. We'd have to talk. One of the purposes of the joint committee has been to avoid a referral to ordinance committee and extended hearings before the ordinance committee, but this may be such a hot topic that it's going to be referred to the ordinance committee or CDNR or some other committee. That will be at the prerogative. But my expectation, Alex, is there may be a referral at the council's prerogative for further committee hearings. Then it would typically come back to the council for second hearing and ultimately adoption. So there is much process before the council will finally be forced to vote up or down on whether it's, Andy's proposal really only deals with owner occupancy of just single family and duplexes. So whether it includes Andy's proposal or not, I'm confident it will be a topic of discussion before the full council.
Jack and then Zariah.
No, I was just going to say, I think the whole point of having us here in this process is to sort of at least share our perspectives as 3 members of the council and as the ordinance committee to give you all some sense of what the council might do. It's tough because we don't know what the other 9 members are going to do, but I hope that I feel like I've been clear about my position on it, and that's going to continue to be my position at the council level. I don't know exactly what other councilors are going to do. I know for sure, though, that there's other councilors who agree with me, who haven't been here, who will then have the opportunity to weigh in on this. But I can't speak too much beyond that.
Zariah?
And yeah, not to keep folks, because I think I'm wondering the same thing to some extent as well, and not to keep folks much longer, but if Chip is open to giving a little bit, I'm just curious as to where you're at, and I won't be able to ask you because this will be, I think, going to ordinance committee. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, if you're open to speaking on that, on where we're at right now.
I'm sorry, where we're at or where I'm at?
Where you're at based on the language that is in front of us.
Sure. I would say I am willing to hear, I'm looking for a compromise position. Let's put it that way. I am well aware, I think, as the whole committee is, of the competing policy objectives. I've heard a compromise that Andy has put forth. I am willing to consider others. But I do have some concerns if this were passed exactly as pressed as to that group that would be harmed by this proposal. Having said that, I have heard some arguments tonight for the first time that, I'm now looking at it in a different lens. And I fully expect that there will be voices at the council level, who bring up positions that I have not thought of. And I'm also keeping an open mind, on that front. I don't mean to be wishy-washy, but that's sort of where I'm coming from right now.
Thanks.
Jennifer?
So just from a process perspective, so we have the drafted language in front of us. And I think we've done a lot of work on that, and then we've gotten to pretty close to, we've really dug in on that. And I feel like we were getting pretty close to where people were supportive of where we're at. Maybe there are some things that need a little bit more discussion, but I feel like we're close on that. So there's that piece. And then there's the question of the 3-year. And there's the additional question of the, changing the owner occupancy of the single family and duplex. So I feel like there's 3 different things. So I'm not quite sure how we want to sort of sequence how we would support various elements of that or support pieces together. Or so, I think we do need a motion of some kind, but I'm not quite sure sort of how we want to, address the different components of this so we can get to where the majority of people are at.
So let me suggest a few different ways forward. One is if people choose not to do anything tonight, we could do that, which would not be my recommendation at all. My recommendation at this point would be to move forward and to advance this onto city council, and the city council, then, as I said before, will do what they want to do. And that's all part of the process, and that's the way that it should be. So that's one option. The other option would be that there could be a motion to move the proposed zoning change and minimum housing code forward to the city council with a recommendation as it is. And another option would be to a motion to move it forward with a proposed amendment on it, or other proposed changes. The proposed changes could be anywhere from the, something like what I've suggested, any other kind of changes that anybody else might want. My change is always focused, as we've been talking, on the single detached dwelling units and the duplexes. But if anybody has other changes beyond those, which I haven't heard tonight, but if anybody has any changes beyond those that they'd want to see, that could be incorporated into a motion. Emily.
I think I'm realizing I'm really far off from other members of this committee. And I would support something that had across the board owner occupancy requirement for all units and gave up to a 2-year transition period for existing hosts to transition out of their business in a sensitive manner. And that's what I would support. I don't think we are going to be productive as a committee anymore. So I plan on voting against sending it forward. However, I think that we have the votes to send it forward, but I feel like it's important as it goes forward for city councilors to know that I don't support it in the manner it is. So I'm going to vote against it, but I think you guys have the votes you need to move this forward so it can be considered by city council.
Thank you. Jennifer.
So Emily, in terms of, so it sounds like we were to change the 3 to 4 unit, is that the one that doesn't require owner occupancy?
Yeah,
right
I'm feeling like my understanding of the process that we got here, I thought we had done that and that we had a consistent owner occupancy requirement across the board. So I felt like that happened in several meetings, and I thought we had something else in front of us tonight, and I was surprised to see that we still had allowed non-owner occupancy for anything. So that's my, it's really important to me. And so that's something that I'm not going to compromise on. And I am sympathetic to the people who have gotten into this business and are accustomed to the business and have been benefiting from it. And I understand it's a difficult transition. And I think allowing a 2-year transition to move your business out of it, make a couple more years of increased profits, and move those units back to long-term rentals would be in the benefit of the city residents. So that's what I'm going to support.
So can we vote on a motion to have that change to owner occupancy and see how that fares, and then
yes,
move on?
So I'd make a motion to change it to owner occupied across the board for all units. And I also don't understand why 5 units all of a sudden, I think if you live in a building and it has more than 5 units, you should be able to Airbnb a unit. So I would make a motion that it be owner occupancy across the board, allow a unit in 5 units.
Emily, it sounds like you have multiple items in your motion. Let's take them one at a time.
One motion
if you're
that
comfortable doing that.
Sure, I'll make a motion that it have an owner occupancy requirement across the board.
Okay. Is there a second to that motion? Okay, seconded by Alec. Is there any further any discussion on it?
Andy, just a question for Emily. Does that also include the transition period, or do you want that to be separate?
I'm trying to just make it one thing because Andy suggested that I think the transition period seems to me like something that would be, sort of a staff decision, or maybe at city council, there'd be a delay in when it came into effect or something. I don't know that that would be written into the language.
Right. David, there is no transition period in this right now, is there?
The only thing we've talked about in terms of a transition period is essentially what Emily is suggesting. Sorry, the Jets are here again. That we would essentially delay active enforcement of violations of the ordinance for a year. So the rules would go into effect. People would be able to start coming to get permits. We wouldn't pursue violations until whatever that period of time.
2-year
is
period.
Right.
Right.
But
And I
Megan,
know this isn't what the motion is about, but people aren't renting out Airbnbs now because of COVID. So even a year, that might come down to 6 months or even 3 months, who knows?
People are renting Airbnbs.
Megan, just again for clarification, if we're doing that, not, telling people that we're not enforcing the rules for a year or something, you couldn't register unless you qualified under the ordinance.
That's correct. Yeah,
And-
you would still have to come, like, in order to get a permit, you would have to meet the requirements of the chapter 18 and of the zoning ordinance.
So anyone who we're saying we're giving the year to come, to phase out of it, they're not ones who would be able to get the permit or the registration because they don't qualify for it.
That's right. They're the people who potentially are doing a short-term rental now that wouldn't be allowed to do it under whatever passes. And it would give them time to discontinue that without active enforcement.
Okay, so I want to come back to Emily's motion. Your motion was to remove to require that for all units, it has to be owner occupied. Is that right?
Correct.
Do I have that right, Emily?
Yes.
Okay, and that was seconded by Alex. Is there any further discussion on that? All right, then let's go to the vote. All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand, and mainly raise your hand so I could see. So I think I see just Emily and Alex. Is there anyone else who I'm missing? Okay, all those opposed, raise your hand, please. So it's myself, Jennifer, Harris, Eves, and Bruce opposed.
Oh, Eve's video came back. Sorry, it was frozen for.
Okay. All right. So that motion was defeated. Emily, is there another one that you had?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Are there any other motions? Bruce.
I'm not sure how to articulate it, but I'd like to readdress and make a motion for Andy's 3-year option as a separate discrete companion to what we refer up to City Council in the end.
So that would be let me just try and phrase it, see if this is correct of what you're saying. It would be a motion to allow owners of single detached dwellings and duplexes for 1 unit of duplexes to allow them to short-term rent them, even if they don't occupy them, provided that they've owned the property for more than 3 years, if you're using the 3-year term.
Right,
Is
and
that
I would also add that would run with the property. So to sort of address some of the concerns about folks being sort of cemented in as their wealth and not someone else's, it would offer an opportunity for those that purchase the property if people moved.
okay? So once it's used that way, it would continue.
I'm sorry. So if the property is sold, it could. I'm looking to others like David and Scott and Kim on whether or not how that could work. If that could work.
How would that convey?
I think what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, Bruce and Andy, I guess, that you have to have owned the property for 3 years or more before you can short-term rent either a single-family home or a half of a duplex where it is not your primary residence.
This is the complete case of us solving a problem that no one's asked us to solve.
Eves,
Nobody.
you're not on mute.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't see how you could convey it, right? If you just bought it, then you don't qualify as having owned it for 3 or 4 years.
Well, the clock would start over. If I
Right.
owned it for 3 years and, or 10 years, and then I sold it to Scott, he would have to hold it for 3 years before he could short-term rent any portion of it.
I think that's a better construct. So I would change my motion to include what David just said.
David, would you repeat that?
Great. That property owner has to own the property for 3 years or more before they can short-term rent as an off-site host, a single family or a duplex. That's what I understand the concept being put out there. The challenge here, of course, is then the ownership part. And does that lead us into this rabbit hole of what does it mean to be an owner, partial owner, corporate owner, trustees, all that?
First, let me ask you, Bruce, was the way David presented the motion what you had in mind?
Yes.
Okay. So, and you made a motion to that effect then?
Yes.
Okay, is there a second to that motion? Okay, seconded by Harris. And so now we have the discussion, and there was David's question.
David's question of clarification or
Yes.
how to determine.
Of how you determine, to me, it would be, you look at, I mean, ultimately, you could look at the deed, and if it's the same deed for more than 3 years, it's the same owner. And if it's a different deed, it's a different owner.
So as long as this deed doesn't change, I'll just think of one scenario here where, my parents' property, they pass away, the property conveys to a trust. I'm a co-trustee of that trust. Is that a transition of ownership that then the 3-year clock starts over? I only use that as an example because I'm sure there are 20 others where it gets sticky like that. And that's the challenge of tagging something to ownership.
Bruce?
I think there's a whole body of title law that defines it precisely as to what a transfer is. And in the example of probate, it's deemed a transfer at death. You could revert to the title standards, which are very extensive.
Zariah?
I don't even know if I'm allowed to discuss in this part of it, but I guess I would just say, I wonder if this is a case of you all making, it seems like a fairly complicated change that I think would be complicated to enforce, complicated to understand, instead of just, to fit a very specific circumstance. It almost feels to me that if you just want to allow people to do it in single family homes and duplexes, then you should just say that instead of finding a complicated way to seem like you don't, but still allow it for a few folks who already are.
I think we're trying to avoid speculation. That's why.
Yeah, I actually don't agree with that. It's not what I believe. I actually am concerned about people, and we're seeing that there's a very hot market of people who are trying to escape the city, have a ton of money, can buy a lot of property at very high values, and maybe are going to live here not very much. So I think that, I am worried about speculative purchases and people Airbnb-ing them. And I do think that having some time limit on when you can actually start using those properties in the way that we've been talking about makes sense to protect that. So I haven't totally agreed with the idea that this is about, people accumulating wealth. I think it is to a certain extent, but it's also people who already have a ton of wealth and can swoop in to our city and just, do whatever they want with a a piece of property, and that's not what I'm not in favor of that. And I don't think that that's what, is behind this. So I think the premise of that, just do it in a single family home and get rid of the 3-year thing, is not something that I could support. So I'm sort of half and half with Andy's proposal. I want the, longer term ownership to come into play. And I actually think owner occupancy is important for single family homes and duplexes as well. So that's where I'm coming from.
But what is the difference between somebody who is doing it now doing it? What makes that a good thing that we want to preserve, and somebody new doing it is a bad thing, is the part that I don't understand. I think we're saying if you're doing it now, it's good. We want to help you keep doing it. It's good. We want to make sure that you are still allowed to do it. But the minute you're a newcomer, it's bad. And we want to make sure you can't do that. That feels really weird to me. I don't know why nobody else feels that way, but.
From my perspective, it is a compromise. It's like we're trying to accommodate people that have been doing this, that have, a reason for doing it. They've been, what we've heard over and over and over again from the people that have been coming to these meetings is that this is something that is helping them afford to live in Burlington, support their income. They're not wealthy people necessarily. Maybe some of them are, I don't actually know, but it doesn't appear that way. So I do see this as a compromise. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think any compromise is perfect, but I think that's what we're trying to get to, is some kind of balance here. So I don't think any solution that anybody's put on the table is perfect. So I think we're trying to balance some needs here. My concern is sort of speculation on property. And I think that's what we've seen in other cities that I'm trying to avoid, is that we're a really hot destination. I don't want people just buying up property and flipping them for short-term rentals. Somebody that's lived here for 20 years and wants to Airbnb their house, I actually do feel differently about that. So I feel like they've made a commitment to the community in a different way. So I think it may be hard to articulate, but I do feel that that's different.
We're going to go to Jack, Denise, and then to you, Megan. Okay.
No, I agree with Zariah's point, and I also think the point of inconsistency goes to the triplex and 4-unit as well, because if we're saying we don't want people to swoop in and speculate and buy Airbnb, then why are we allowing non-owner occupied for 3 and 4? Because that's exactly what's going to happen. And then it's also the point of, if we think it's bad that investors with a ton of money just swoop in and buy property, well, that's been happening, and those people are going to be able to benefit from this. So it just seems weird to me. But I think this will be coming to the council, as Zariah said, and we'll have our opportunity to keep working on it. So I think whatever you all want to do, and the council can have our say from there.
Eves?
I agree with Zariah's point. I think she's absolutely right. I guess the one thing I'd like to ask, and this is for Jennifer and Jack, is, you guys are talking about, very wealthy people swooping in here and buying up units to Airbnb them. I'd love to see some data that suggests that actually occurs, because, you heard Mr. Hinsdale, doing an Airbnb is labor intensive. It's far more labor intensive than just doing an annual rental. And so and if you're very wealthy, frankly, you're not going to go into that business. I mean, that's a labor intensive business. That's a pain in the ass. So I unless there's data that really sort of supports that, I'm a little bit unsure that actually would really happen, just for what it's worth.
Megan.
I just have a clarifying question about the intent of this, and it actually relates to a question that was put in the chat as well about this idea. When it comes to the issue of 3-year ownership, the way I've understood this from Andy is that if you've owned the property for 3 years today, and whether or not you've been STRing it, you could have the opportunity to do that if you wanted. if a year from now, you've owned the property for 3 years prior to that, you could have the opportunity to short-term rent it if you'd want. It's not, this privilege is not contingent upon whether you've already been short-term renting your property. Is that correct?
That's the way I had intended
Okay,
it to
I
be.
just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Any other discussion on, so we have the motion by Bruce, seconded by Harris, I believe it was. Any further discussion on that? Emily?
I guess I posed the question, why would someone who has the right to short-term rental after living there for 3 years ever sell their property? I think it gives people who lived here for 3 years sort of a golden ticket to be able to short-term rental. I think it'll encourage people to not sell their properties and short-term rent them. And then more and more properties will go into short-term rental over time. I'm just posing that to everybody, like, explain to me why. I understand some people might not have the money up front to buy a second property, but I think a lot of people could, so.
So it's a big deal to create a short-term rental building, I guess. Harris?
Just quickly, I appreciate you bringing that up, Soraya, and I can see your point. I do believe this is a compromise that, in terms of home ownership, 3 years really isn't a very long time for most people. Maybe that should be shortened. I don't know, but that's all I want to say.
Anyone else? All right, so we have Bruce's motion. I think we're ready to vote on it. All those in favor of his motion, of Bruce's motion,
Can
please
you
raise your.
state the motion again? Can you just?
Sure,
That'd be helpful.
it's to, Bruce, do you want to, or do you want me to?
Go ahead. Sounds like you've
Okay.
written.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong when I say this, it is to allow owners of single detached dwellings or for duplexes, 1 unit of a duplex, to be able to use it as a short-term rental if they've owned it for 3 years, even if they don't live on site. Did I say that correctly, Bruce?
Yes.
And was that clear to others of what I said? Emily?
So if you live in, just clear this scenario, I just want to be sure we're talking about this. If you live in Connecticut and you've owned a house in Burlington for 3 years, that entitles that person to short-term rental their property over somebody who lives in Vermont or Burlington and buys an investment property that day.
Yes, under this proposal, and then the one who buys it today in 3 years, they would be able to.
Okay, just want to be sure.
Bruce, did you have?
Yeah, I would say that's possible, but that's not the testimony that we've heard. So yes, I mean, sure, I think it would be possible. But I also think we could say that about any of the proposals that there's some externality that's negative, and we're trying to reach some kind of a compromise, and this is the only one we've been able to get any traction on.
All right, I think we're ready to vote. All those in favor of that motion to amend the proposed housing code, please raise your hand. Where is Eve? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, I think, myself, Harris, Bruce, and Eves. All those opposed, please raise your hand. So opposed is Emily, Jennifer, and Alex. Okay. So that
And
one,
I just want to explain my vote because I think the piece of it that I couldn't support was the change in the owner occupancy piece.
so the proposed chart and minimum housing code was amended. Are there any other motions to amend? And if not, is there a motion to advance the whole package, including the zoning amendment to City Council? Eves.
I'll second.
Okay, So a motion to advance this package as amended to City Council with a recommendation.
Thank you. I was just going to ask if it includes a recommendation and if you approve the report.
And it includes the report?
It includes the report and the recommendation, yes, please.
And Jennifer, is that part of your second?
Yes.
Okay, good. Any further discussion on that? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. So I see myself, Jennifer, Alex, Eves, I think your hand was up, Harris, and Bruce. Any opposed? Emily opposed. So it passes 6-1. And this is advancing on to City Council. Thank you, everyone, for all your hard work on this. Soraya, Jack, Chip, good luck when it comes to you. Thank you for your participation in this. You know, I think we've made a lot of progress. I suspect on ways that you might be modified on council, but who knows what's going to happen there. And I think just having the opportunity to hear all of us, you know, on all different sides of this and hearing from all the different people who have come to us, I think will really help as all of you advance this on City Council. So thanks for your participation in this. I think we all really appreciate that. And thanks to the full commission for all your work on this as well. And to Megan and Scott and David as well. So thanks to everybody for your help on this one. You've come a long way, and for the commission at least, it's closed for now, and your work on the council is in front of you. So enjoy it. Good luck to you. And with that, we'll move to our next item, which is item 4, reapproval of municipal bylaw amendment report ZA-21-06.
So it's been a little while since we've had one of these, but this is coming back to you as a commission for a procedural reason. And that is because staff recommended and the City Council Ordinance Committee supported making a minor change to the proposed amendment for the shoreland buffer and setback requirement. That change was to change out the term no-mow with the term low-mow to better represent the intent of the provision for that buffer treatment along the lake shore. So as you know from past experience, this is coming back to you with an opportunity to provide comment if you would like, but for you to reapprove the municipal bylaw amendment report for council for their public hearing on April 26th.
Any questions or comments? Harris.
Yeah, I like that change. I think it's a lot more accurate and kind of what I was trying to say also last time.
Alex.
Is no-mow defined? I mean, low-mow?
Yes. Yes, the funny thing is we defined it when we were using the term no-mow, and it wasn't really no-mow, it was really low-mow. And so now that's what it says.
Yeah, I knew that's what Harris would say too, is that was, you know, essentially what he was saying is that allowing people to mow it even once a year isn't really no mow. So right. Scott brought this term up and it actually is a much better representation of the actual definition that's provided.
So the recommended action is to reapprove the municipal bylaw amendment report.
That's correct.
Alex?
Make a motion.
Okay.
I'll second.
So motion by Alex, seconded by Emily. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? That is unanimous. Great, thank you. Then item 5 is commissioner items. We have an upcoming meeting on April 27th. Any other commissioner items? Harris?
It was brought to my attention that my term is coming up in June, and I decided I'm not going to renew my term. I've been on the planning commission about 10 years now. Feels like a good amount of time, and I am doing a lot of work with REV, Renewable Energy Vermont, on their executive committee and doing a lot of committee work with them. So I'm going to focus more on that. So I appreciate being here, and I'll finish out the term.
We'll miss you, Harris.
Yeah, thanks for letting us know. We really appreciate all the work that you've done and all the service you've done. Pretty incredible what you've contributed here. So thank you so much. You'll be
We'll
missed.
keep you on the hook for a few more meetings, though.
Okay.
Absolutely. We won't let you go that quick. Absolutely. Any other commissioners? Bruce?
So last time, I think we should refocus the zoning ordinance. And last time I spoke about this, is that it really presents a real barrier to the next generation moving into purchasing housing. And I outlined 2 last time, and I'll give you a third this time, and I'll continue to tell you what I see. And that's that duplexes aren't allowed as permitted uses in 2, I think it's 2 of the residential zones, but at least RL. And that's an example of, we're really sort of pulling up the plank to the next generation and driving up cost. And things like that, when you aggregate them, are substantial.
Thanks, Bruce. Anyone else? Emily, did I see your hand? Emily?
I participated in a panel discussion with some members of a task force that was working on lake quality. And a couple of items that came up, basically it was like, we're getting allocated all this money. How do we best deploy it? It's going to have the biggest impact in improving water quality. Looking at things that we can do that are low hanging fruit that may be inexpensive. And one thing that was identified in that meeting that I think is under 2 things that are under our purview are recycling toters, because they have a lot of garbage. If you look at my neighborhood in particular right now, the streets are just strewn with garbage, and that ends up in the wastewater collection. And right now it is actually there is a rule, that an ordinance we put into effect probably 10 years ago. I worked on this to require recycling toters for all rental buildings. However, there doesn't seem to be any enforcement for it. And now that I realize that the rental registration is part of our purview, I would ask that we add recycling toters to the rental registration checklist, so that it's something that code enforcement makes sure that you have. Because the big reason why there's garbage all over the street is because the bins don't have lids and they overflow. It's already an ordinance on the books, and it's just that step of enforcement that I think would actually make it happen. And it's something that doesn't cost a lot of money and could have a big impact on wastewater and the lake's water quality. And then the second thing that came up in that discussion was compaction of soils due to parking out of designated parking areas. And we talked about that. And we talked about just the simple act of having a physical barrier that defines the parking area for existing buildings and existing parking structures. We have a lot of conflict about parking in green spaces. I'm sure Kim Sturdivant can speak to that. There's constantly war happening about cars parked on front lawns and so on and so forth. So requiring physical barriers that would keep cars from compacting soil, that soil compaction leads to greater wastewater runoff and contributes to our overburdened wastewater system. So that is something that also could go into the rental checklist for inspections. So I just wanted to bring those 2 things up as 2 low-hanging fruit things that we could do that would have an impact on lake quality.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, then we'll move on to item 6, which is minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications?
I move that we accept the minutes and the communications.
Motion by Alex, seconded by Jennifer. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand or say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications, and item 7 is adjournment. Motion to adjourn by Harris, seconded by Jennifer. All those in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. And again, thank you to everybody for all your hard work on these items. This has been a long year slogging through this.
On Zoom, no
Take
less.
care. Yes.
Right.
See you
Take
later.
care. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Andy.